Dear colleagues, students, guests, and friends of value-focused thinking, it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce and announce a very special guest lecturer this afternoon at the University of Bayreuth. Our very special guest professor this afternoon is Professor Dr. Ralph Keeney, and as an academic tradition, I'd like to introduce him with a few words. Mr. Keeney received his first academic degree, a Bachelor of Science in Engineering, in 1966 from the University of California, followed by 2 other degrees in electrical engineering, and finally he received his PhD from the world-famous MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in operations research. After different positions between the academic atmosphere and practical organizations, he finally, and we all say thank you for that, ended at the university. First of all, at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, where he served from 1983 to 2002, and since then he works for Duke University in North Carolina as research professor of business. Ralph Keeney has been honored with almost 20, in numbers, 20 awards assigned by prestigious organizations within decision analysis, operations, research, and management. He is author of several books and articles. His main book, Decisions with Multiple Objectives, written in 1976, is not only republished several times, but also cited by more than 10,000 articles, let's say almost any article within multi-criteria decision-making published in the last 2 decades. His special areas of expertise are decision analysis, risk analysis, and management decision-making. He's an authority of decision-making with multiple objectives. During his professional career, he has contributed substantially towards the development of decision analysis and risk analysis. His experience includes corporate management problems, energy policies, large-scale siting studies, and environmental studies. He has been a consultant for several well-known organizations all over the world, for example, even the German Parliament, the Deutsche Bundestag. Now, at this point, I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to all our students that participated in 2 empirical studies we have been started in the last few weeks, and, well, of course, very special thanks to my research assistant, Dr. Johannes Siebert, who established the personal contact to Dr. Keeney and organized everything so well. Please give applause to Mr. Siebert. Now, as some of you know, I spent half of my lifetime in healthcare management, and in healthcare we very often use warnings of risks and side effects. So let me give you one warning. This lecture today may change your life. It may change your life because it really is upon something we are having as a problem every day, but that is what Ralph Keeney is going to introduce you. So he is really a rock star of decision-making theory. So let me change the mode. Would you all now please give a very warm welcome to the one and only Mr. Ralph Keeney.
That was very personal. Thank you very much. And now I have a big challenge here, and I thank you for the very personalized introduction. That's so nice. And you all know what decisions are. What value-focused thinking is a collection of ideas and procedures that can help you make better decisions, hopefully. And I'd like to begin with this question a lot of the times when I speak about decision-making. Why bother to make decisions? I'm sure sometimes you think, I've got this decision and I'm worried about it. It takes time. I may make the wrong choice. I wish I didn't have to make decisions. So why do it? Why not just skip them? Do something else more interesting, more fun. And the reason, I think, is there's no other way whatsoever that you can purposefully influence anything in your life. That's it. Purposeful influence. But you don't just want influence, you hopefully want to influence your life for the better. So it's worthwhile, of course, thinking a bit about how I can make better choices, and you need to think a bit about what better means in various contexts. So here's an outline of what I will talk about. The first one describes roughly what value-focused thinking is. The next 6 points, or 5 points, some of the ideas that are relevant there. The last one is how you can use it, and the final one is how it's used in some businesses and organizations. And a way I like to describe this and to really point out how important decision-making is, you all know this idea that you're on a path of life and you're going like this, and you come to where there's a fork, meaning one path goes this way and one path goes this way. And you get to choose, and your life will be different on each of these. Maybe not substantially so, but somewhat. And then you go a little further, there's another fork, maybe 3, and you can choose, and you keep going. But imagine if you were on a life path with no forks. Think of that, no forks. What would you do? You're on that path, and you walk a little bit each day, the next day, but all you do is follow that path, and in 90 years, the path ends, and so do you. That's not a very interesting life, or it's not one I would like. So I want those forks to be there. They're very important. And of course, I want to choose the forks that are the most interesting, or the most enjoyable, or the ones that are challenging in certain ways. And how do these steps fit in? Well, 2 and 3, identifying and organizing values, are some guidelines for how you can choose well when you meet those forks of life. Number 4 is, what if you come up to a place and there's some forks, and you don't particularly like this one, and you don't particularly like this one? What's a good thing to do? Hopefully, create a third fork that's a lot better one, and maybe a fourth fork. That's creating alternatives. And value-focused brainstorming is, suppose you're going with a collection of people, your friends, or a team, or a company, and they're on paths also. And again, you come to a place where the different paths don't look so good, and maybe it's not even clear where there are paths. Again, you need to create alternatives, and value-focused brainstorming can perhaps help you do that. And then there's the case that I really like. Who makes those paths anyway when you're going through there? Sometimes I'm somewhere on my path of life, and I can see something over there, or I think I do, or over there, but there are no paths. What I want to do is create paths that didn't even exist, where there were no paths out there. I call that decision opportunities. So that's what those parts deal with. And then the other 2 are uses. So what you need is your values to help you decide what to do. And values is a simple term for me. In this context, it's not a big philosophical term. It's what you care about in the context of the decision that you're dealing with. And it obviously is important to know what you care about, because then you can do a little better job making your decisions. So how should you make these decisions? And the key word there is should. Not asking how do you make decisions. That's an interesting and important question. Psychologists study it a great deal. Behavioral economics, as you know, is a field about it. Used to be called decision research. But first, you want to articulate your values, what you care about in this decision context, because that's the whole reason to spend time thinking about the problem, an answer to the first question. Why make a decision, a particular one? And then these values should guide all you do on it. If you identify from your values, gee, this is an important one, it's worth a little bit more time, etc. And then it will help you develop decision opportunities, better alternatives, needed information, evaluating alternatives, in many cases, communicating with others, and that's what value-focused thinking is. So, how is it different from the way decisions are typically made? Often what happens is you're going through life and all of a sudden you have a decision problem. That's the fork in the road. It's like you turn a corner, you didn't even expect a fork, but now there's a fork. And once the problem occurs, then what you do is you try to identify or often just accept the alternatives available at that place, and then you evaluate them and choose. Well, all your focus is on the alternatives, and yet the alternatives are only a means to help you make the decisions that achieve what you really care about, your values. So it's a little bit backwards thinking. Start with what you care about, why you're even spending time on the decision, create alternatives, then choose. Don't start with alternatives and just, well, I have to take one of these, and then do it. So how do you identify your values for a particular decision? And where do they come from first? They come out of your mind. The nice thing about values, all the information available for your values is right there in your mind. Sometimes it's hard to find. A mind is a pretty large place. And on business problems and things like that, sometimes from stakeholders or knowledgeable individuals, they can help out. Sometimes when you're trying to figure out your values, for instance, on what you want to really study in school, for instance, people who've been in schools before or study, and sometimes faculty members, can help you stimulate some thoughts to come up with your values. But then they become yours. It's just a process of how you bring them out. And so some key questions: can individuals articulate their values? And can they do that well? And when I first started working in the decision field, I thought when I'd go to some company and they say, well, we have this problem, they would know the problem. And then I'd say, what do you care about? Meaning, what are your objectives? And they would just write them down, very simple. That's not the way it is. It's a tough thing to do. And we did a few experiments on this that you can appreciate, I think, because this related to this particular one, MBA students in a U.S. school. There were 300 in the entire class, and all of them participated because they had a homework assignment where they had to do this, and then and they got graded on it, more or less just doing it. It didn't have right answers. But then I got to use all of that information as making some of the points to them about decision making. And an internship in a U.S. MBA program, and most of the students there are 26, 27. They've graduated from college, worked 4 years, and then they come back for 2 years, and then they'll do something else afterwards. And the summer in between those 2 years is a very important time. They go work for a different type of firm in a different location, wherever they want to do, and they learn a lot about what they want to do when they get out of school a year later, and many of them get their offer from where they spend their internship. So it is an important decision, and it's a real decision. So we did an experiment, a couple colleagues and I, and we asked them to write down their objectives. This was one of the things on that set of questions. And then they showed them a master list of objectives that my colleagues and I put together, talking to some other MBA students, that we thought they might like, and said, check all the objectives that you think are relevant to you. Then we compared what they wrote down with what they checked. Or to be precise, we asked them to compare it, because they might use different words than we used on our list, so they could match them up. And this was the third point here. And then the fourth point, for every one that they checked or listed, we asked them, how important is it on a scale of 1 to 9? And, what happened there? Oh, I can use this, sorry. Here's the examples of the master list of objectives. There are about 34 of them there that they could check. I know it's a busy slide, a lot of things, but it's there. Well, the original list, people put down 6.4 on their own. And then we divided the 300 students into 6 groups, roughly 50 apiece, randomly. One group, we said what sometimes you say to people, look at the list that you compiled and add anything that's missing. And on average, they got half of an objective more. But the rest of the people, we told them, research has shown that on average, people get less than half of their objectives when they write them down, and then challenged them, but said if you try harder and think harder, you can do a much better job. So they were motivated to do it. And then we said to one group, add as many as you can think of, another add at least 3, another add at least 6, at least 9. And then a last group, we just gave them a few general words to help stimulate their thinking, such as tangible benefits, intangible benefits. We didn't want to hand them exactly the things. And this shows the additional number of objectives that they listed. In the best case, when we said add at least 9, they added roughly, 4.9 on average to the 6.4, so that's 75% more. But the number of objectives they checked were 20. So they're still missing a lot. And again, this doesn't happen with just students. This happens with anybody, and it happens somewhat with me. It's hard to figure out everything you care about, but there's some ways to help stimulate it. And you might think, well, they got all the important objectives, but they just missed some that weren't important. It's not the case. The ones that they wrote down, the average importance on that 1 to 9 scale was 7.28, and for those that they checked but didn't write down, 7.23. Essentially the same. So the experimental results just show people get roughly half of their objectives. And so how can you help people? Here's a 4-step process that you can help yourself and help people too. The first thing is, of course, you write down anything you can think about. But then you can stimulate yourself to do a better job, and then you can use whatever list you have to think harder and more, and then you want to translate them into a common format. The first one, writing everything down, is easily. The way to stimulate your thinking, you can say, what is an alternative that I would really like? It could be hypothetical even. And then ask yourself, why would I like it? And of course, that's going to suggest one of your values. Ask, what would be a consequences I would find terrible or good? And that's going to indicate one also. You can use goals or constraint. If there's a constraint, well, if you're thinking of jobs, it has to pay at least this amount. Well, it says at least the pay is one of your values, etc. So there's a lot of things, and these are written in a book called Value-Focused Thinking, but a lot of articles, and Dr. Siebert talks about these in his classes and everything. It's just helping you stimulate your thoughts on thinking. The third one, once you have any value listed down, ask yourself, why do I care about this? And the answer, as we'll see in a couple minutes, often is something else you care about. And then why do you care about that? So you can kind of fill in the set of values that you have. And then it's nice to get everything in the same format. And a verb and a noun is a nice format. So for instance, here's a set of 4 examples of values stated as an objective at the bottom. Verb is minimize. Environmental damage is the object or the noun. Maximize profits, etc. And many times when you ask people, what do you care about, the value, they state it in very different ways. And you don't want to limit their thoughts. Any way they come out is fine. Activity, concern, criteria, etc. Once they have listed it down, as in the middle column there, you can easily convert it into a verb and a noun. So you have some organization to things. Then what you want to do is put them together, because one of the most important ideas is the distinction between a fundamental objective and a means objective. So we converted the values to objectives, and now we're talking about fundamental and means. Fundamental is something you really care about in making this decision. It's the basic reason for making it. The means objectives are things which can influence how well those fundamental objectives are met. Now, in a simple business example that everybody can follow the logic, somebody might say, one of my objectives is to get a new product to market earlier. And so, why do you want to do that? And they might say, well, to gain a competitive edge. Why do you want to do that? Increase sales. And why do you want to do that? Increase profits. And why do you want to do that? And why do I want to do that? Because that's one of the things we're supposed to do in our company. So that suggests the first three are means, and the last one's fundamental. And of course, profits are helpful if it's a publicly owned company, because the people who invest in the company would like a return. And you can put these into a network that shows the relationships of a lot of things. I'll show a couple here. Here's one that I worked on with the environmental agency in the US, looking at a national ambient air quality standard some years ago for carbon monoxide. And when I went there, I said, why do you care about carbon monoxide? And how would you think about evaluating it, and what are your concerns? Once those were translated into objectives, they care about things like, this is actually carbon monoxide, I should have said. They care about it because of the emissions. Why do you care about emissions? Because it leads to concentrations in the air. Why do you care about that? Because people would get doses by breathing of carbon monoxide. And why do you care about that? Health effects. So this not only says, here's a means-end set of relationships to what you really care about, it indicates how you would model this with a scientific model. Because the people who know about emissions are typically engineers, and you need to know what's the chemical composition of whatever is being burned in that case, etc. The concentration has to do with how much comes out here and the weather. So it's atmospheric and meteorological models. And then the doses is a physiological model. Physicians and people like that know how the body uptakes concentrations of carbon monoxide, etc. And then they also have an idea of what the health impacts of different doses may be. So you can put together the different amounts of science. Without doing that, no one knows all that information. And then costs and things are fundamental there too. And the key thing is the trade-offs between the health impacts and costs. Now you might ask, what costs and what health impacts? It's another question. You can take the fundamental objectives and go down into a hierarchy and categorize them. The most general ones at the top, health effects and cost, and more detailed ones. And in this case, talking to the people at the environmental agency, the main things were heart attacks, angina attacks, that's pain around the heart, and peripheral vascular attacks. And obviously, they distinguished them, what heart attacks. Fatal heart attacks were different, of course, than non-fatal. And there's an example of some of the costs that would come up there. And so you can use these types of objectives differently too. A good thing is a fundamental objective gives you all you need to evaluate the alternatives, because that's what you fundamentally care about. If you include fundamental objectives and means objectives in your evaluation, you're double counting. So anytime you're concerned about pollution of some sort, and there are many problems, as you know, that we are as a society or as a group, if the pollution is important because it has health effects or it affects other aspects of the environment, such as whether a certain type of fish can procreate easily and things like that, if those fundamental objectives are there, pollution is important, but it's important because of that, so you can evaluate in terms of the consequences, again, that are fundamental. And whether it's a fundamental or means objective depends on the context of the problem. If you take a big problem, something here can be a means objective, and then if you focus on a little problem, such as this problem, we're saying just minimize the amount of pollution, then certainly a concentration could be fundamental for that problem. Now, here's just an illustration of a different problem where a lot of these ideas were used. When internet commerce was first coming in, I asked a lot of people what would be some of the concerns they would have, their values, for choosing among buying products on the internet or buying products in brick-and-mortar stores or in normal stores. And this is an organization of what came up, but this was the fundamental objectives that they had, and I'll put them together in a moment. And then here were many of the means objectives that they had. There's typically a lot more means objectives, and this puts them together into a means-ends objective network. The arrow just means influence. So all of the objectives on the left influence how well the ones on the right are achieved, and that's how people would like to see their products or their purchase behavior really do well in terms of those objectives. So creating alternatives. I mean, you have to have alternatives to have any big impacts. And there are obviously the potential choices that you have to pursue your objectives. And they have to be completely under your control. Some people will say, well, the alternative I want is the best one. That's the one you want to choose, but you don't know the best one at the beginning. You have to evaluate that. So you need to be specific and totally be in control of it. Somebody would say, the job I want is the one that has the most flexibility. Again, you don't know which is the most flexibility. You can choose specific jobs. You'll have an idea of how flexible they will be, presumably, but there will still be some uncertainties there. And two very important facts about alternatives: you can never choose an alternative that you didn't think of, obviously, but that's important because if you can think of a better alternative than any that are available, that's a great contribution. And second, your chosen alternative can be no better than the best one in the set you're considering. Again, that stresses the importance of creating alternatives. And what do we often do on alternatives? Well, many times we don't consider that activity worth a lot of our thoughts, unfortunately. Because people, if they have a problem, they want to solve this problem and get it behind them. And if you have 4 alternatives, I mean, I've gone sometimes to consulting firms and they have 4 alternatives, and they say, I want to know which one of these to choose. And if you go away for a week and you come back and they say, how are you doing? And you think, well, we've thought of 5 more alternatives. We now have 9. And the person might say, that's terrible. You're going in the wrong direction. We want you to find the best alternative, not make more and more. You're making our problem more difficult. But again, if you can create better alternatives, you're really affecting the likelihood that the result of their decision will work very well. Why do people do a poor job? One, they don't spend time thinking about it or consider it worthy of thought. They choose the business as usual example as the word, or they maybe change it a tiny bit, but not very much. Don't back away and do something really creative or different. Often, they focus on the first possible solution. I know a lot of people who I've asked on their doctoral dissertation, what are the objectives that you have for your dissertation? And interestingly enough, as you know, people spend 2-3 years of life writing a doctoral dissertation. Many times, they're not very articulate at saying what they hope that dissertation will do for them. And I wouldn't want to spend 2 or 3 years of my life without having some idea of why am I doing this. And in a group of about 23, similar to the earlier study where we asked them to write down their objectives, and we gave them a week, and we kept sending them emails and telling them, and this was at Duke, so I mean we kind of knew some of these people, and send in information, and then we showed them a list we can put down. They missed objectives such as I could publish an article easily off some of the chapters in my dissertation, which is important for them because most of those people want to become faculty members. Another one they would miss very often is they'd like to be able to give a great job talk. they have to go around to universities and they give a seminar. And if they've got a very appealing seminar, it enhances their chance of getting a job offer. And so you ought to think of that maybe ahead of time, because you can do the work that enhances that. And one of them that really amazes me, many of them don't get an objective like, I would like to have a personal life during the 2 or 3 years I'm writing my dissertation also. You don't want to give up your personal life for 3 years for anything. So they grab the first possible solution. They go out and they're looking around for a topic, looking around, and then they finally hear of one. Oh, I think I could do that. And then you take it. Terrible. Never make your choice one alternative. The first one to come up is a lot more difficult. Then spend a little, if it happens, it's not the most important problem and you realize it's great, of course grab it. But with an important decision like a dissertation, it's probably hard to appraise whether it's great. At least create a few more, then make that choice. Focusing on alternatives presented by others. I mean, it's your decision. You got a lot more control if you create some of the alternatives. And then procrastinating. And what does one say about creating of alternatives? Here's the word we all know. Think outside the box. I agree with it, but I think it's not very good advice. I think you need to think outside of the box, but not outside of a box. You just need a bigger box that's the right size to think inside of. So here's a picture of it. The one on the left, the box, that's where some people think. Way, way too narrow. And what's outside of that box? Well, the picture on the right. Every single thing in the world. I think that's too big. You don't want to think there. You want to think where it's big enough to cover all the good alternatives, or most of them, but not so big that you spend most of your time walking in an area or thinking in an area that's not very fruitful. That's the right-sized box. And the thing is, the right-sized box for thinking of alternatives is characterized by your values articulated as objectives, because the reason you're making the decision is those values. So that kind of roughly characterizes the appropriate box. And obviously, thinking about how you can better achieve any objective, since that's what you care about, can suggest alternatives that you might use. And in that study with the business school I went to and asked them for their objectives, I also stuck a few questions in, and this was preliminary. I'll show you a little more in a sec. Before I asked them to list any objectives at all, I said, you know, think of what alternatives you might be able to initiate that would enhance the quality of your internship, and write them down. And on average, they wrote down 5.5. And then after they listed their objectives, divided 300 people into 2 groups, and one group said, thinking of your objectives, can you develop any additional alternatives? And on average, they got 3.9. The other group said, think of each objective separately that you have and see if you can create an alternative, and they got 5.7. So this way to stimulate thinking doubled the number of alternatives. Well, this was kind of preliminary things. Here's some examples of the type of alternatives created. And recently, Dr. Siebert and I'm sure some of you students, but students working with him in his class have done some very interesting experiments, a little larger in this context, that are still going on. And one was thinking of alternatives for an internship. And so this was organized somewhat like the objective study I mentioned earlier. It asked participants to write down their alternatives. And then it showed a master list of about 32 alternatives. Check any of those that you think are appropriate. And then it asked them to match them up. And then it asked them rate the suitability of, in other words, the goodness of these various alternatives to meet your objectives. And not all of this has been analyzed, but this can show you the spirit. About 190 participated. I'm sure some of you, and as one in the decision field, thank you. because this is how one learns and learns to help other people make decisions. In that first stage, writing down the number of alternatives, individuals wrote down 6 on average. And then when they were shown the master list, they picked 12 additional ones that they thought were reasonable. And then the difference between the 6 and the 12 were compared. The suitability to meet their objectives was roughly average for both of those, the same for both those groups. The amount of time and effort to implement them were roughly the same. And the self-evaluated creativity of the alternatives were roughly the same, which is pretty interesting. A second study looked for alternatives for an Ausbildungsphase. And there were 2 phases in this study. The first one gave people the objectives that one might have for that Ausbildungsphase, and the other one didn't. It just said, to think about the information you would have and then create some alternatives. And then the second phase divided all the participants, there were about 300, randomly choosing from each of the groups in the first phase. One group was giving fundamental objectives, one means, one the master list, one's the means-ends network, and the control group was just challenged. Said, well, we know that many alternatives are missed. See if you can do better. And in fact, all of these certainly made an improvement in the number of alternatives. When you challenged them, but didn't say use the objectives, they got just under 5 on average, the control group at the bottom. And with the other 4 cases, you can see it's kind of close. It's around 7 that they got. But given first phase got 6.3, I mean, that's pretty good. Again, you only need one good alternative that's better than any of the other ones. And it's really important. So what's value-focused brainstorming? Now, the rest of what we talk about's a little less, in a sense, langweilig. But it's, I think it's all important. Value-focused brainstorming, you all know of what happened on September 11th, 2001. And there's the World Trade Centers, and as a result of that, many things were put in action, some being studies. And the federal investigation recommended we should figure out how to get people out of buildings much more quickly. Most of the cases, it would likely be fires, but there could be some other reasons. And they decided they wanted to have what they called a value-focused workshop on this. And it was 2.5 days, and I had the privilege of being asked to run it. And there were about 35 invitation-only people invited, but they had expertise in all kinds of aspects on very large buildings. You can look at the middle point there and see some of the groups, from architecture to fire safety to how to deal with people with disabilities, emerging technologies, etc. And here's the way I organized the workshop. The first day really focused on getting the objectives, and tons of them, so they could see the larger picture. What are the various ways we can get better egress or evacuation of buildings? Then the second day used all of those objectives, first individually and then as groups, to come up with alternatives, and then a rough preliminary evaluation on the next day. And altogether, there were about 400 objectives or so. 450, and I categorized them with a couple guys who were working with me there who were in the Department of Standards and Technology in the government. And we got 7 fundamental objectives, and I'll show these in a better picture in a moment, and then 12 categories of means objectives. And the next 2 slides just show the examples that different people have put down for 2 of the categories. First one's economic costs. People state the things somewhat differently, but there's a lot of aspects of costs that contribute to overall economic costs, not surprisingly. And then you take another one of the means, safety. There's a lot of different ways that was framed too. So within any of those categories, there's some structure and some relationships also that one could put together. But the next morning, after we finished about 6 o'clock at night, most of the people in the workshop got to go to a pub and had a great time. And unfortunately, the 3 of us worked and organize things. We organize this, which shows how the various big parts go together. And when we walked in the next morning, I mean, everybody in that room kind of saw one of the trees or two of the trees. You could think of the trees as being the boxes, because they were kind of a specialist there. But just to show this picture and how it all relates together, everybody there agreed, oh, I think this is what we're concerned about. And it separates the means from the ends, which was kind of important. The next day, then we used the means, the fundamental, anything to stimulate thought about alternatives. And in doing this, we identified about 400 components of alternatives or complete alternatives, but mostly components, because you'll see them in a minute, some examples. You could do it or not. And then here's another one you could do or not. So if you had only 2 things you could do or not, that's 4 alternatives, 2 to the squared. And if you have 10 of those, it's 2 to the 10th. So as you know, I think that's 1,048. And so you can get an awful lot of alternatives quickly. Here's categories of alternatives, because we did the same thing the second night. Looked at those 400 and categorized them. Some involve sprinklers. Some involve protect-in-place things, like building safe places in buildings that would really help. Different construction things. Fire service. Use of elevators, they often say don't use that. There's ways we can build and certainly use the elevators. All these types of things. And then this just illustrates many, many alternatives. Just a couple in each category. If you look at the top of the left column there, involving communication, I mean, with cell phones and all those things nowadays, you could take the area around a building and send out a message to anybody whose phone's in that building. Some of you probably know this technology, and I'm certainly not an expert on it, but everybody in the building can get messages and the same messages. Who has a cell phone? And everybody knows somebody who has a cell phone. I mean, most people do, of course. And it's things like that can be done, and in general are not done yet, of course. And so then we did a little rough evaluation of the alternatives to get them to see if they created anything they thought was great. Ask them about the usefulness in 1 to 9 scale, feasibility, what's the chance you could implement this within 10 years, and then how creative did they think it was. And we didn't force people to come up with the group thing. This was just a quick exercise on the third morning. And just to illustrate about 10 of the alternatives here, you can see some that look pretty appealing. I mean, if you look down there, the example I said, notify occupants via cell phone, they thought that would be very useful. This was more or less everybody. Where there's 2 numbers, some thought it'd be not useful, some thought it'd be pretty useful. They thought that's a pretty good chance it could be feasible, 50 to 100%, and that it was a pretty creative idea. And so this provided a pretty good base for them to go forward and talk about things, because it was the initial phase. I mean, it's 2.5 days. There's a lot you can do after that. We'll now talk about decision opportunities. This is something I use a lot in my life. And where decision problems come from? They come from basically others or circumstances beyond our control. You're going through life and all of a sudden you get a problem. If you go out to the parking lot this evening and if you have a car there and it has a flat tire, now you have a problem. So you need to do something about it. And it just happened. You didn't create that problem. That's the main thing. We don't create them. And why is the word decision problems kind of a negative word, the way we describe them? Because, again, if you're taking that path of life and there are no forks, nobody has a decision problem, but I would say that's a tremendous problem. So I think the reason we think of them as problems, we don't control them, and we must react. So maybe we ought to create some of our own problems. And then you can make a proactive decision. Because think think of this. Who should make your decisions? Obviously, I have the build a little mixed up. Who should make your decisions? It's not a trick question. Everybody could probably get this right. You should make your decisions. But then, who should choose the decisions that you face? And I think the answer is you should, or at least more often than maybe we do. And the same is for me. I don't mean to be preaching that I know all this stuff. I keep learning things and I relearn things and ask myself, why didn't I remember it? But that happens. And making the decisions on problems that you didn't come up with is reactive. Because if a problem appears, the flat tire, all you can do is react. The decisions on problems that you create for yourself are proactive. That's where you have a lot of control. And this can make some distinctions, as I'll show with some examples in a moment. And I call these decision opportunities. And facing some appealing decision opportunities may mean that you don't need to face some unappealing decision problems. And that would be great. I mean, there's all kinds of cases you can make. Somebody who makes some important decisions at the beginning of school of what they're going to learn and what they hope to get out of the school years to help them in the future time, as well as how to have a great time while you're in school. If they fulfill that set of objectives pretty well, that's terrific. But somebody who comes in and doesn't lay out any of those first things, well, to be in a good position to get a job when you get out of school might face some much more difficult decision problems than the person who's in the first group, anywhere. And value-focused thinking can help you do this. And to give an example, I mean, I always try to think of what are some examples that everybody could more or less think of as being realistic. And I'll use this one to point out some things. But imagine health decisions. And this line here is just a timeline. And you can categorize people into many types, but consider the extremes. You're starting out here, and you go through here, and I don't think this describes people in this room. Some people do nothing, and then all of a sudden they feel sick. Now, this is a decision problem. Should you go to a doctor or not? And then you go to a doctor's office and you walk in or see a doctor. Now they have a problem because you showed up. And they have some alternatives to look at it. What shall I do with you? What tests, etc. Hopefully they learn some things. Now there's another problem. You know, what is the diagnosis? And then they diagnose it. Now there's a problem. Alternative for treatment. It's all reaction. And then hopefully you get well again. And then over here, life goes on until you get sick again. We do know people who do that. But imagine that's really alternative-focused thinking. Let's suppose you did it differently. Out here, you identify decision opportunities. How do I remain fit? How do I remain healthy? So you have to make decisions about exercising, about eating, about some other habits that you might have. And then hopefully here on this time scale, it's the same one. You might not get sick. You're less likely, but you may get sick. And if you do get sick, maybe your body's a little stronger. It can fight it off more easily. That's good. And so you go through here. It might be less severe. And then if you recover, you keep in prevention. Prevention is something we can proactively do. But if we get sick, we're pretty much reactive. And is this parallelism similar in any other things? Sure. And at least in the US, you have the exact same kind of framework for people with jobs. We have joblessness in the US too, and we have chronic joblessness with some people. And what happens, here's today, and there's a subset of people, they have a job, this is fine. They go and they just sort of do their job. If the job is from 8:30 to 5 o'clock, you never see them there at 8:25, and they're moving toward the door at 5 o'clock. And that, they can do that. But then there's other people who are there that don't do it that way. So what happens, though, then all of a sudden, they need to maybe cut people out. The company isn't making enough money or something. Some people lose their job. So this person loses their job. Now they have a problem. They need to look for other jobs, and any place they apply, now the company has a problem. Should I offer them a job? Maybe you get one. If you get one, you sort of have to choose it. If you get two, you have a problem and a choice, and then you get another job. But what would be different here? If you really are down here, you think of decision opportunities. In any job, think, maybe what could I learn here? Or first, how could I help out more? What might I do here that would be more interesting for me to do, and that might even be helpful in the future if I'm looking for other jobs? There's a lot of decision opportunities. You can go volunteer to do things. One of the things I did when I was at MIT, first on the faculty, what happens with young faculty is they often get told to teach courses that they don't want to teach, because no one wants to teach a few courses. And they end up getting those courses. When I got my first job there in the engineering department, I went to the department head, the structure, the top, and I said, what are you particularly interested in the next few years in this department? And he was interested in kind of spreading it to more analysis of public problems and things like that. So I went away and thought about what he said and thought about designing a course in that area and teaching it. I went and proposed it and said, I would like to do this because that's something I would like to do. He said, well, that'd be great. And I said, and that seems like enough work for me for the first term in teaching. He said, yeah, I think you're right. And so what happens then 3 months later when there's all the courses that are not appealing to teach? He says, well, we need somebody to teach this terrible course. And they're thinking, well, Keeney, we can't have him. I never got those terrible courses. And it's proactive thinking, and there's some other aspects there. In order to have this alternative occur, I had to create something that was good for the person who controlled that. And that was the head of our department. So it's kind of creating a win-win opportunity. It was good for the department. It was good for him who had the power. It was certainly good for me. And I guess it probably wasn't good for somebody else who got stuck with that course. But you never know who they really are. Now, you can do that on an awful lot of things. One other example that I did when I was a student as a freshman at UCLA. I was in engineering. 250 students were told to design an electric shoe polisher. And that was kind of innovative then, but I did a little study and decided, I don't think this is really what I want to do. But I thought, why are they telling us to design a shoe polisher? And you need to practice on some things, and the shoe polisher is something. And I learned about this study that was done by others in engineering, senior people at UCLA, and it was developing things for people in the Andes Mountains in South America, way up high, and talked to some of the people, and they were interested in getting a cement mixer, but there's no electricity up there and things like that, at least then. And so I went and proposed that I don't design that shoe polisher, I design a cement mixer for high in the Andes, and you got to find out and I got to do that. I'm the only guy designing that, and it was kind of simple, but those big oil barrels, or those big metal barrels, they do have barrels up there. You put it on the side, you put cement in, and if you could roll it, it'll mix up the cement. Throw some water in, but that takes a lot of effort rolling it around. So I kind of built it like a personal lawnmower in reverse, and the llama would hook up to the thing and pull the thing down. And we had pictures of it, and they sent it down there, and it was fun. And I got to do what I wanted to do. And you can do a lot of that with this type of thing, being proactive. And what you want to do in these things is give somebody an offer that they can't refuse. a lot of people, you can think of a great alternative, but you have to have somebody's approval. Well, how do you get that approval? You figure out a way to make the offer a good thing for that person. So create a win-win. So here's a picture of it. And then I'll give you an example that Professor Schluchterman mentioned at the beginning that was very relevant to my professional life like this. Here's values to me going up, as you can see, right there. Well, yeah, right there. And over here's to someone else. And what happens, I get an idea and I think, wow, it'd be great if I could make this happen. And what happens, suppose I create that alternative. This would be great. Well, you can see I get a lot of advantages there, but the trouble is, this other person here needs to approve that or agree with it. That doesn't look too good to that person. They're going the wrong direction. It's worse for them. So what I try to do is, I know what the features of this alternative are that are great to me, and I maybe create a bunch of other alternatives. And this person doesn't even know I'm thinking about this. And then I think, gee, that sounds like a good alternative. That's great for them, and it's great for me. So what I've done is identified this, and I negotiate it for them, and I negotiate it for me, so to speak, and they didn't even know I was doing this. And then I walk in and say, guess what? I got a great idea for us. And I propose that alternative there. And what should they say? Well, they're down here with the status quo of that much utility, and they can jump up to this much utility. It's an improvement in their life. Hopefully they will say, gee, that's kind of a good idea. Now, where did I use this? I use it all the time, but the book that was mentioned, Decisions with Multiple Objectives, I just graduated from MIT, just finished being a grad student, and started in the faculty, and Howard Rafa, the person I wrote that with, was, I think, easily the best known decision analyst in the world and a fabulous guy, and he's at Harvard, which is a mile away, 2 kilometers maybe. And so I wanted to write this book with him. I didn't think I could do it by myself. And this was clearly, you can imagine, would be a fantastic opportunity for me. Couldn't be anything better to do. But it wasn't so clear why it would be such a great opportunity for him to spend time with a grad student for a long time, eventually writing a book. But I thought about his objectives, which I knew very much. One, he certainly would like a book on this topic to be published, but he wouldn't get it done because he had too many other things that he was interested in that had higher priority. And of course, he wouldn't like to be limited in his time or inconvenience. Nobody does. And so I said, we can work on this at any time, any schedule. We can have meetings anywhere, school, houses. You can cancel at the last minute when things come up. No problems. If you find out the writing or the quality of the ideas are not up to your standard, you can just cancel it. And but it will get finished if we go through with it, because I don't have anything else important, anywhere near as important to do. And the only thing left for him to say no to was if he really didn't like me. But if you knew him, he is such a nice guy, he would never say that, even if it were true. And so then he agreed to that. And the offer of flexibility turned out to be very important, because this possibility for an international institute in Vienna came up, where the East and West, Soviet Union, U.S. Academies of Sciences, the Academy of Sciences of East and West Germany, first time they ever cooperated, because the countries didn't even recognize each other, but it was set up to have the national academies as members, and they did recognize each other. And I spent a couple years there and had colleagues from all these places, which was great. But obviously, we slowed down a little on the book. I mean, it was a pretty important thing to be doing there, and fairly high level. The head of the board of directors was Gavishyanni's son-in-law. He was the premier of Russia at that time. And so, small group, 200 professionals, but pretty exciting place to be, and so our book slid a couple years. Fine. I was happy to keep it alive. you can really end up with those things. So then, value-focused thinking and you. So that's kind of the ideas. I mean, do a lot more proactively creating things for yourself. The strategic values of your life describe who you want to be and guide you how to be that person. And you ask yourself, well, should a really important firm know its strategic values? Most people say, oh, of course. And then, why? Well, it's an important firm. And I ask people, are you important? Or at least to you, are you important? Most people, if you think hard about that, I hope the answer is yes. Maybe you should have your strategic values. They can change if you want a little bit, but some idea of what's important to you. And Lily Tomlin is an American comedian, and she said this statement that I really love. I always knew I wanted to be somebody in life, but perhaps I should have been more specific. And laying down what you hope to achieve, or at least in a 5-year period of life or something, gives you a little guidance of how to be specific. Now, I always kind of thought this way, but when I worked on this book, Value Focused Thinking, I thought, what are my objectives of life? And it looks kind of simple, but it took some thinking, but it's fun to think through this. And those top 4 things is a complete collection of basically what I'm pursuing in life. The first one is basically, I call it enjoy life, but what it means is the second thing here. Fun, excitement, emotions, experiences. When I was, some years ago when I'd say what this meant, it meant sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then the second part, intellectually fulfilled, it means these things. So these two are feeling and thinking. And that's what I hope I get out of life and the experiences there. But that's what I get. But then some of my other objectives is I hope to give something, and that's the other two. Contribute to the quality of life of family and friends, and hopefully make some little contribution to society. So here's the structure of my objectives. There's those 4 fundamental objectives. What are some of the key things I need to possibly achieve that? Well, I need to have worthwhile activities and worthwhile relationships. To get those, I need to have a lot of opportunities to choose among and the freedom to choose. When I was younger, I used to say my objective in life was to be free. But somebody sang a song that said, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. So I had to be more specific about freedom. It's a means. And then here are some fundamental things, or important things that are means. Some people will say the most important thing in my life is my health. My health to me is important. But I thought, what if I'm extremely healthy, but I don't enjoy life much, I don't use my mind, I don't contribute anything to family and friends or anyone else? Then I'd consider myself like a very healthy tree. And that's not what I want out of my life either. So, although out here, having good health is critical to doing any of these things well, it alone doesn't do anything for the value of my life unless I do some of those things. The same are true about a couple other ones here in the modern day. I mean, one, you need time to pursue the things you really care about, and that includes work. I mean, I love work. And of course, you need some funds. And these get traded off. I mean, there are some people we know that earn a lot of money, but they have no time and it hurts their health. And then if your health is bad, it's harder to earn money, etc. And if you have a lot of time and that's because you're not working, then you don't have much money and that doesn't help your health. So the balance is pretty crucial out there, and the balance depends somewhat on your values, but it should be balanced anywhere, I think, there. And then here's just a list of the first 3 are straight off my strategic objectives. And then for professional things that I do, because you get asked if you'd like to do something, and then you think about them and say yes or no. And I should say the opportunity to come and enjoy myself in Bayreuth, and it certainly was a very easy decision. And then this just shows examples of all kinds of decisions that I do make. I mentioned a few of them already, using some of the ideas that I mentioned here. One simple one, just to mention, I did live in Passau for 3 months once and was a visiting faculty member at the school. And I wanted to live right in the middle. I mean, if you're a visitor to Passau, I didn't want to live in a Vorstadt. I mean, I wanted to live and experience being in Germany. Just like if I lived here, I'd certainly like to live near the center of Bayreuth. I'm here once in my life. You just learn so much more about it and meet people. And I found a tiny place, very inexpensive, but it was on the Fußgängerzone. And the thing is, the guy didn't want to rent it to me. And I would have paid double the rent. I mean, it just wasn't very much because, I'm going to be there once in my life probably. But I think of values. What are his values? And I just asked him, why don't you rent it to me? And I was going to be there September to Weihnachten, just literally on the day. And he said, well, if you leave, just rent it through December, I won't be able to rent it to anybody in January because the students wouldn't rent anything new then. So I said, oh, I'll rent it for January. I'll rent it for 4 months. He was happy, got to move in right away, because if you go somewhere for 3 months, you don't want to look for a place to live for 3 weeks. You want to find a place quickly. Worked out great. Very simply, but at the principle, try to understand the values of the person, create an alternative that they like. Now, here's a problem that's different. We had a son. Well, we were going to have a son, and we did have a son. We knew it was a son. And my wife was asking me about names, and our son was, she was 4.5 months pregnant. And she said I was not putting enough effort into coming up with the name. And we knew it was a boy, and I said, we're completely on schedule. We eliminated half of all names, meaning girls' names, and we're 4.5 months pregnant. Now, as it happened, he was born at 5.5 months. Fortunately, he was off the scale on healthy for kids born that early, and especially then. And he's 25 now and extremely healthy, so that's great. But she said the thing, you could imagine to me that there was no way I could reject it. She said, maybe we should write down the objectives of a name. I have to say yes, given me. But the thing is, if you were starting a firm, the way I say it, suppose you left here and you're starting a new business. Would you think the name of that firm would be important? I'm sure you would think, gee, that's pretty important. And then ask yourself, do you think your kid's important? Yeah, sort of. No, and so maybe it's worth a little thought, but it's fun. I enjoy doing this. So we each just made a list. It took us 10 minutes, and we put them together, and we worked on it a little over a while. Here's a list we came up, and I've talked about this in all kinds of places, from the North Slope of Alaska and everything, and everybody likes this example. But you think of these, like some names in English, there's different ways to spell them. It's a little easier if people know how to spell your name once they know your name. We didn't want a unisex name. Some names are equal for boys and girls, and we just preferred that it be a boy's name in this. And reasonable initials. You don't want the initials to spell some terrible word or something like that. And anyway, you can go through them. And I've asked many people to write down objectives, and only one time of a name, of maybe 1,000 people in groups, I said, write them down, ever got objective number 11. And we just thought the world is getting smaller. You don't want the name of your kid to sound like or be something like, as you heard, the Yugo car in the old days or anything like that. And I heard one time, years and years ago, Rolls-Royce in England was thinking of marketing their silver cloud in Germany. That was the name of one of their styles of cars, and they were going to call it the Silber Mist. You don't want to make those mistakes. And they didn't make that mistake. But so we go through and, we narrowed down the names and we had 30 and then kind of narrowed it to 7, and we got down to 3. And then we asked a lot of people who were not born Americans about the names. And the 3 finalists were Jeffrey, Scott, and Gregory. And whenever we ask anybody in any part of Europe, except the UK, what do you think about those names? Most of them didn't like Scott as much. They said it kind of sounded hard. I don't know if you have that feeling or anything, but we had a lot of people say that. And that surprised us, but that's fine. So, and he didn't turn out to be named Scott, even though we like the name. And sometimes when I give this presentation and I say, well, now let's go on to another example, and everybody says, what's his name? What's his name? Anyway, he's named Gregory, and I've had people say, yes, as if it's the right answer, or Gregor. But anyway, it was just a way, it was enjoyable to do, but I tend to think this way. And a lot of people said, well, we didn't exactly do that, but sort of that's what we did. They probably didn't as much. Now, here's a decision opportunity that would be relevant. Personal decisions and death, and this, in a sense, relates to some of, your research, in a sense. Not literally, but the spirit. In the U.S., and maybe also in Germany, but you cannot die of old age or something like that. You have to die of a medical cause. And legally now, as you can figure out things more. Here's the data from 2000. I did this some years ago, and 2.4 million people died that year. And what I wanted to do is look at somewhat how they died. And there's the big 15, and then the actual causes of death are different than the medical. They can be smoking, overweight, alcohol misuse, that thing. And then there are personal habits that influence that, of course. And what I did is I backed up, and it's really decisions. If you believe the only purposeful control is decisions, that's what's influencing this. And so I wanted to know how many of the deaths could have been avoided if readily available alternatives had been chosen. And I didn't say if good alternatives were chosen. I'm not assuming somebody who smokes made a bad decision. They can think about the pros and cons and make it. But there was a readily available alternative of not doing that. And then there are decisions many places along the way there too. You can stop smoking, and as you know, 5 years later, your statistics for health effects are very similar to people who have never smoked. And some people say, and I know the case as well, you really have a habit that you are connected to that you cannot get rid of. At least in Canada and the US, over 50% of the people who have ever smoked who are currently alive are not now smokers. So it isn't like everybody is hooked and can't change. So what I did is I got a lot of data. There's an awful lot of medical data here. And there was a giant spreadsheet, but this shows the example. I took a given actual cause and a given disease which has this medical indication. From the medical literature, it said 40%, 0.403, of the deaths of people over 35 who died of ischemic heart disease were due to smoking. The data said 47,000 died that year in the age group 55 to 64 of ischemic heart disease. Therefore, multiplying that times that, I got 19,000. And the thing is, the total was over 1 million of the 2.4 million deaths I could easily get from readily available alternatives. I didn't take heroic alternatives that, for instance, you go in every year for a physical checkup once you're 45 years old. That's a little tougher to do. Makes sense, but I didn't take even things like that. And so I got all these deaths. And this was interesting, and part of my reason for wanting to do this is you don't need somebody else to take care of you for these. I mean, a lot of people think, boy, the medical community needs to do a better job. The government needs, in our country, speaking of, the government needs to do a better job in everything. Maybe so, they could do better. But many of the people who are complaining could do a much better job. And what was fascinating to me is I looked at the percentages by age groups, and if you go from 15 to 24, all the way up to this group, that's the way it came out, it was basically 55% were due to personal decisions, and even 50% for this group. They're going to drop at some point because the only people left are those that kind of had healthy habits, didn't die, so they can't die from one of those unhealthy things. And thought of a couple other things that almost all of the people who died were due to their own cause. Only some, like drunken drivers who run into people, kill someone else, etc. But if you looked at this data for, say, 1910, or the question in 1910, people had almost no control over whether you die, at least in the US, and I imagine here too. Because if you drank water, if you ate food, and if you interacted with people, you would get some terrible diseases, and there was no way to stop them, and you died. The big killers were things like diabetes, smallpox, polio, tons of tuberculosis, tons of those things, nothing to do about them. And so in 1900, people had very little control. I mean, the only ones I could think of, imagine somebody driving their horse buggy and they're very drunk and they go off the road or something like that. Not very many people. And of course, now, 50% of many of the people in the middle. It's just a total change. And we could do maybe something about it. And I thought it was maybe 20% in a rough thing in 1910. Well, then, 2 slides on this. Colleague Aduka, grad student, and I wanted to look at these 15 to 24-year-olds and ask, what might be done about that? I mean, parents kind of worry about that when they have a young kid. And to be very quick here, this lays out your objectives. If you follow some of these things, and what you want to do at the high level is build a great relationship and really understand your child, and there's interactions between these over time, and you can communicate well, you know what they're doing, etc. And part of what you do is you try to get them to understand they're not invincible. The truth is, young people, as well as older people, can die. And it's pretty tragic when it happens. So it has to be recognized, no, that could never happen to me. And then another thing that you want the persons to know they have tons of control. When your child's 5 and 10, arrows like this, you have a lot of control, who they see, what they do and everything. You can kind of watch out. But once they're 15, these arrows disappear. I remember, I talked to my son sometimes about this when he was 16, and a few things I'd do, I'd have him read obituaries, which means the thing in the newspaper when somebody died. And some of the kids he knew, obituaries of people his age. There were one girl was texting and driving, and 5 girls died who were 18 years old. And he knew a couple of them and knew of the others. And I'd just say, what's different about them than you? And he'd look at me like, what do you mean? And the difference is, of course, all they did was just text once, and now, unfortunately, they're not living. And then I'd say, suppose you were in a situation like that. What could I do so that wouldn't happen? And he looked at me and said, you couldn't do anything. I said, you're absolutely right. I couldn't. What could Mom do? Nothing. What could you do? Well, he had some ideas, and I said, who has total control? And of course, it's him. And we all have total control over ourselves. And, I didn't want to scare him all the time, life's so dangerous, but I knew him well enough, that wasn't it. But I think he did realize he does have total control. If he cares about these things, and of course he does, he can think about some of the actions he might wish to take in situations that he may find himself in. And that's where you want to be here, and then that can help. Quick one. This just shows once you get transfer the problem to the person who's 15 to 24, because you don't control them. This just shows what happens when you're drunk driving. And then value-focused thinking and you, and I just have, well, maybe 5 or 10 more, probably 10 more minutes. It's worthwhile to do some of this. Clarify your objectives, what you really care about. It's fun. You know, it's no pressure. You can do it when you want. It's not real easy. And then think about your objectives in some particular decisions. Sometimes it's hard at the beginning, but it really gets a lot easier. And why bother? Well, you can figure out some great decision opportunities. That's a good thing to do. Create better alternatives and have some principles that you might follow for your life. And here's, Constanza found a great picture. I want you to live your best life. Now, a couple things just on business applications quickly. I mean, this is used on things like this. This is for most of you who might not recognize it. It's Vancouver, British Columbia, on a cloudy day. And this is downtown British Columbia. This is downtown Vancouver. This is a big park. This is about 3 miles from here. This is a reservoir, and that's the drinking water source for Vancouver. And they were going to clean it up some, and to do that work, they're going to transfer the water over to one of their other reservoirs, because they can build facilities here to clean it up some, and that's in one tunnel, and bring it back. And to just show a couple shots that are interesting, and that's why it's fun to do decision work, among other things. This shows the way that looked before they put the dam in that created that lake. And this was only 1952, 3 miles from downtown Vancouver. I mean, that looks pretty wild. This is what it looks with the dam right there. And here's where they're putting in the pipeline corridors to go way deep in the ground, lower than sea level, 7 miles, 11 kilometers over, and then they clean up the water a little bit. They bring it back in another one. And what happens right here, whenever you build a dam, whenever you build a dam, one thinks of this as the dam, and technically it is. But now that the water's filled all this up, this is also a dam. When it was a canyon here, that didn't hold any water, but now it does. Water is always oozed out of that, as it does in all dams, and so they worry about water getting into the soil and landslides and things. But added to this, so I worked on that once, in the pipeline, which it shows you, it goes from this reservoir over here all the way to this reservoir. This is where people live. The pressure of the water that will be traveling down underneath there is more than the water pressure outside there, so water will exfiltrate, come out of that, eventually get to places that can cause problems. And so what this did was structure their problems. They have the hydraulic concerns there, what all the water does. And then if it starts getting in there too much of it, you can have seepage. That's not too bad. But then sediment loss, that's some of the soil coming out, so it gets weaker there. That leads to landslides, and that could eventually lead to a dam breach, which would be, billions of dollars of problem. And then we looked at their fundamental objectives here, and the decision problem in this case was, should they line those pipes with steel? So basically inside the rock pipes, should they put steel? And it would cost 10,000 Canadian dollars per meter to line it. So it was an interesting problem. And then one other one, the final one, and then this has to do with American Express, the company you all know. Is 5 minutes appropriate? For many years, from middle 80s to 1995, they'd been losing market share because Visa and MasterCard were getting bigger, and I think a lot of European competitors. And what they'd always done, they'd evaluated people who applied for cards based on their contribution they expect that they might get to net present value. And what they wanted to do is change this. They wanted to change it to a multiple objective function. that would include market share too, right there. That's what they wanted to add, so they needed a multiple objective function. I cut a couple slides out, that's why that happened. And so I worked on them with that multiple objective function and got their objectives. And here's the key objectives that they have. In the beginning here, you have acquisition expenses. That's the money you pay to get potential new customers. And then you influence the number of new members for charge cards. That's where the normal card they have. And then they have credit cards too. And that influences things. And in particular, what was fundamental here, we used short-term cash flow, market share of the two kinds of cards, and short-term cash. So the market shares contribute to the short-term cash. That aspect is considered here. But they also affect things like the network and the market effects and corporate image. And so these objectives were important for their influence on these things. And that objective, short-term cash flow, affects the shareholder value, and they can use their short-term cash to buy other companies or make investments. So it affects here, and that affects long-term profit. It doesn't go into here much. So what happened? Here's the range of things that were considered, just to show it's kind of an important problem. The two things is the profit, short-term profit, could range from $6 to $12 billion in the 3-year period, and the market share could range from 12 to 20%. Now, I have 4 slides I'll go over very quickly, which are sort of quantitative, just for some people, not just to see how you do it. So you want to do an analysis that deals with these 4 different objectives. It integrates them together, and it's just a mathematical model of value. It's called a utility function. Beautiful. And anyway, it's not heavy-duty math. I don't do that. But it's an objective function with a particular property. You can use the average. And then you need inputs for that, and those are specific value judgments like how important is one objective versus the other objective. But you really need to know how much important is a change on one objective versus another. In this case, using values of several of the key objectives there, $3 billion was equivalent in value to the 8% from 12 to 20%, meaning if they could have one of those positive changes, jumping from 6 billion to 9 billion, or jumping from 12% to 20, they would be indifferent. They were even in value. And then this shows how important are various changes within those ranges. These are called single attribute utility functions. And then this, you can just put it together mathematically and analyze it, and that's what we did. And Qinglin ran the models there. Over 50 million people were considered for cards that year, facilitated communication among various groups there, and it did really affect over 10 million of the offers that they made, is what they said. And what occurred? In the first 6 months after doing this, their overall market share increased for the first 6-month period in the last 20 years. And it went from 18.31% to 18.9%. And that's independent appraisal that did that. And you could calculate how much or how important is that in terms of profit, because we had profits and market share. And you could say, well, what if that didn't increase? How much more would profit have to be equivalent in value? $447 million, not a small amount of change. And then here's 2 things that were in the Wall Street Journal about it after a little while. An independent comment just saying they did a great job of dealing with the tough situation. And the other one is by the guy who was the president of American Express then, Ken Chenault. He's now the chairman of the board. And he just said this is the result of an increased focus on that and the results of that. So there's 3 slides left. Succinct summary. Values are the foundation for good decisions. Because the only reason to make decisions is to hopefully influence something you want, what you care about. And you don't have to be selfish. It doesn't have to be for yourself only. And you don't just want influence, of course, you want it for the better. That's why the values are key. And they indicate why you care about a decision, so they're important. And Yogi Berra said something that's kind of interesting. Your values indicate where you want to go, essentially. He said, if you don't know where you want to go, you just might end up somewhere else. And also, they're the foundation for good decision-making, and I've stressed this a lot of time. And it's not real easy to get your values, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to try. And last slide, how do you learn more about doing some of these things? Well, certainly a lot of programs in the US that I'm familiar with have courses in decision analysis, decision making. At Fuqua, the Business School of Duke, they have 2 basic courses, one called Decision Analysis, one Decision Models, and they're not required for the MBA students there, but about 80% of the students take them. Find it very useful because you could be the best marketer in the world, but if you don't make good decisions, you have a lot less impact than you'd have. You could be fabulous in a technical field. You're still going to have to make some decisions. So decision-making fits in anywhere. Now, if there aren't courses, you can read about some of this, and in all cases, it's important to practice, because it's a skill, like many of the skills in other fields. In medicine, you could go to school and learn about what to do, but clearly you get much, much better once you start doing it and seeing things. If you play foosball, you can learn what you're supposed to do, but it probably would help to play the game. Many of you have probably played football sometime in your life, and think of how great you were the first time you ever played. You probably got a lot better with a little experience, regardless of where you are. And where can you practice and get experience? On personal decisions. Like if you're going to dinner tonight with some friends, what are the objectives you'd like to achieve at dinner? I mean, is it literally just to have food inside you? Could be. But, you probably want to learn some things, have a discussion, enjoy this, meet some people, whatever. Think about them. And those small decisions you can get a lot of practice on. And then I'd just like to certainly thank Professor Schluchterman and Dr. Siebert for inviting me here. I'd like to thank all the students that work with Johannes on various projects and who I've met on Skype, and we'll see you in the next couple of days doing some of the things like this. It's interesting, and I know many of you, again, participated in some of the studies that they're doing, and it's very important that you do that, and that makes a contribution. Because maybe if collectively we happen to do a few things right and learn a little bit more, that will be because of your efforts too. So thank you very much. Huh?
You stay here. Huh? Stay here.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this course. We will proceed and we'll have chances about 5 to 10 minutes for questions and answers. But before, I have to tell you some organizational things. I hope lots of you have taken the opportunity to put their name in a list, and Professor Schluchterman opens this talk, or the introduction of Professor Keeney, that this talk might change your life. And this is exactly what we would like to study. That's why we are interested in how you think those things through, and maybe we will come up in half a year, a few months, and then we are interested in your experience, what you have learned from this talk. That is why we ask you to put in your email. That's the first thing. The second thing I have to add, we have 2 lotteries. You could win those books signed by him, and the winners are Carmen Malke and Annika Pfeiffer. You could get the books afterwards by Professor Keeney. So, now we have the chance to go for questions and answers. Who would like to ask something? Do you have any problems? Maybe it's better open up. press.
Could you tell us which was your
have to
most
press?
difficult decision you made in your life? Could you tell us which
You
was
have
the
to press
most?
this.
Yes. Could you tell us which was the most difficult decision you made in your professional life?
The most difficult decision I made in my professional life, to come down to one of the most difficult ones, I can mention. And it helped me, and the style might help. I was at MIT and I was on the faculty. It's a great place to be. And if MIT were on the West Coast, I'd probably still be at MIT. I thought it was a fabulous place. And each year, if I looked at the decision is, shall I stay one more year or go? Oh, I can stay because I can leave next year. And then I could stay because I could leave the next year. And then it hit me, I realized if I do that forever, I end up there at the end. So I changed the frame of the decision. And I thought, suppose I'm a professor here when I'm 66 years old, and my professional career has been equal to, and I thought of two people who were the people I most respected in the field. One was Howard Rafa, and the other was the founder of operations research in the US, who was at MIT, and they had incredible careers, and I thought my life would be a failure, not my career. And I didn't think I would even be at their level. It's just that made it so easy because I like the things you can do in the West Coast, much more outside things and everything. So it was easy to resign from MIT. So it was tough the way I was looking at it, but then it was easy with the different frame.
Further questions? Professor Schäfer, please.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. What should we do if we not only have influences between the objectives, but something conflicts or contradictions? So if we have the objective to save lives, but also the objective to reduce costs, so there are obvious conflicts. So what should we do in these situations?
Well, I think the question is, what should you do when there are conflicting objectives? From my perspective, if there are two objectives, they are conflicting to some degree, otherwise they are the same objectives. And we always just about have conflicting objectives. I mean, that's what this third book here is on. Multiple objectives are conflicting. We were going to title that Decisions with Multiple Conflicting Objectives, and we decided that's longer and redundant. So the question is, you have to trade off the values. Because if you, at some point, sometimes you're lucky. The alternatives is bad enough you can think of things that are better in terms of both objectives. But then once you've found that set of alternatives, you can save more lives for more money, or less lives for less money. Now that problem in the government context, I've thought a lot about. And some people would say saving lives is so much more important than money, even if it costs billions. Well, one of the things, if you take government money in the US, and first of all, the government has no money, it's really mine and a bunch of other people's money, but that money, if you spend, and we have legal rules that require spending $5 billion to avoid one death from a rare cancer. If we didn't do that, and we spent $5 billion on highways, we can save Americans' lives, or maybe Germans' lives if they're there driving, $5 million a life. It's way too far out of line. I don't want to save one and basically let 1,000 die. I'd rather save the 1,000 because they're the same people. They're me and others. So you want to get kind of close. It doesn't have to be perfect in optimizing. And then the other thing, Aaron Wildowski was a philosopher and social scientist at Berkeley. And he said richer is safer. And he did a lot of thinking about that, and I figured out a way to quantify that once a lot more data became available. And as you take money, again, I'll speak of the US context, and you take money from everybody into the government, and then you save some lives here. Well, you make everybody poorer. And so there was enough data I could calculate, what do people do when they keep their money? The government doesn't take it. On average, they live longer. They don't die from these things. The statistics are clear, and in today's money, for every maybe, depending on some things, $7, $8 million that we take, somebody's going to die. And sometimes and they're usually the poor people. Sometimes people don't turn on the heat in the winter as much as they should, and they're elderly or something, and then they just don't get around to it, they freeze to death. Some people might look at their car and their tire they need a new tire, but they can't afford it this week, next week, and they're on a rainy road and they're in a crash. You can never identify exactly who it is very easily, but the statistics are pretty clear. So guidelines for what some of these trade-offs can be given. Again, I'm not for optimizing to the last point. Don't spend billions saving one statistical fatality. I mean, get down in a reasonable range. And there's trade-offs in all kinds of things. You take a trade-off and you're going to Hamburg, or maybe I should say further, Amsterdam. You could take the train, or you could take a plane. One costs more money and one's faster. And you just have to think about the relative values of the differences there. And that's what multiple objective decision analysis thinks about in some other fields. It's tough, but it's value judgments. Thank you.
Mr. Schoppik?
Yeah, okay. One problem with real-life decisions, common to many decisions, is that the alternatives aren't presented neatly in one point in time, but unveil in time. For example, choosing potential spouses, or buying houses, or even job offers. What would you recommend for dealing with this problem?
Well, certainly recognizing that in the decision of when to make a decision is also a decision, and what one to make. And we all know of those problems where, just like you said, I could choose between A and B today, or wait a little and maybe C will come around. But sometimes waiting for C may mean A will disappear, and like the house problem. And it's just the reality of the situation. So I can think of that as a series of decisions. I mean, in a sense, right today I can think take A or B or wait. So there's more uncertainties about the wait to see if a C comes in tomorrow. And so I just have to take that uncertainty in and to account, and how much likely it is that C is going to be better. And then I also think at some stage, on a house, it's a pretty important decision. But some that aren't so crucial, I think, well, is the time that I'm in the process worth it too? I mean, even if I get somewhat of a better choice, that I spent 3 more hours on the decision might not be worth it. But I think it's just other things that are important in the decision, and I would consider them separate at different points in time, but interrelated.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we have to close our question and answer session. Thank you very much for participation, and thank you very much again for coming and giving this talk. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Thank you, Johannes, and for all your work.